Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today we're going to be looking at Vespiquen. I'm going to do a discussion-based video rather than just a deck list video because Vespiquen is very versatile and pretty much the deck can change weekly based on what you expect here and there every time. And last time I did a Garbodor discussion video, it got a lot of good feedback, so I feel like every now and then I feel like mixing some of these videos into just the regular deck analysis. These seem to get good feedback, so let me know down below if you prefer these to regular battle videos and such, but regardless, I feel like these are fun things to do at times. So, let's get into it with a quick introduction. We're going to start off looking at the recent performance of Vespiquen, and then we're going to look at why it is popular and why it is strong right now. We'll have a quick look at a skeleton list, and then the main bulk of the discussion will be how we fill these extra slots once we've seen the skeleton, and then we'll have a small portion on how to counter Vespiquen. If you are going to Indianapolis, we have to assume that this will be one of the better archetypes, and it may not be the most popular one out in the field, but it'll be one that you definitely have to keep an eye out for. And potentially, if you're playing a deck that doesn't naturally have a good matchup, you may have to consider countering Vespiquen because it could end up being one or two of your rounds. So I believe this is a valid discussion and should be interesting. So let's start off with recent performance. It's got one top 32 in Seattle, and it actually ended up placing second as well, which is very good. Then we have in Birmingham just one top 32 placement. It also did quite well in the League Cup, I remember, but at the same time, it was just pretty much one player piloting it. Birmingham was really not popular with Vespiquen. It's been much more a US-based archetype. I think Europe is still very pro Decidui, and that may be one of the reasons why we're not seeing a huge amount of Vespi over in Europe. But yeah, it's more sort of popular in America, and you can see that the wave of hype started to increase after seeing the second place finish from Seattle. As we see in Madison, it then claims 6 of the top 32 spots, which is much healthier, and it actually came first place, and another was in top 8. That was Michael Pramort winning the event. And in Mexico City, there was a healthy 3 in top 32 also, 2 of which made it into the top 8, which is very strong. It's got a high conversion rate once it gets into the top 32, so not only is it a good deck to make it that far, but also it can go even deeper into tournaments. So let's look at why that is the case. First of all, the deck is very non-EX focused. Single prize attackers are very, very good in the game. Especially when we have support from things like Octillery and Oranguru. We can end-proof ourselves, which is actually a point at the bottom, but I'll also mention it back at the top, because it means that we don't have to play down many Shamans and many Tapu Lele GXs, so forcing your opponent to take physically 6 prizes is awkward, and some decks are worse at that than others. Think about things like Vikavolt Tapu Bulu. It's amazing at hitting such high numbers that it always wants to face 2 prize attackers. Well, if they're only claiming 1 prize for each time they do it, it's a bit of a strain on their resources. So just being non-EX alone is like a huge reason why Vespiquen is successful. And if you just look at the card, it's a really efficient attacker. Both its attack costs are covered by a double colorless energy. You have free retreat as well, which is excellent. 90 HP on a grass type is fine. Being grass type is actually a big deal right now, because there is archetypes like Greninja, like Lapras, like Lycanroc, potentially Zygarde even, because Zoroark and Drampa are gaining hype. Some people may be looking to counter these archetypes via weakness. We can come in with our grass typing and do well there. And at the same time, because we are a stage 1, we can gain more typing using our evolutions as well. So we can become water, fire, lightning type also, as long as we have our abilities online and if we choose to play these different evolutions in our lists, which is very cool. So yeah, just having that DCE cost means we're pretty much always good to go. Stage 1 that can be forested up, because we are a grass type, which means you can potentially attack on turn 1 for an amount of damage. And it's really not hugely difficult to start shoving Pokemon into the discard pile when you play a heavy engine of Acrobikes, Ultra Balls, Professor Sycamores, and then physical cards like Unknown, which can get itself into the discard pile, as well as Klefki, which can chain onto Unknowns for extra damage. So it's quite quick to get going in terms of damage, and it becomes really big one-hit KOs as we reach the late game, similar to Garbodor. That's the way I feel we have to compare it. The Trashalanche eventually will get one-hit KOs, as to will Vespiquen over time. You can also tech for specific metagames, which is a big reason why Vespiquen has remained popular throughout its career. I remember having a brief history with Vespiquen, winning a regionals with it, back when Night March and Totina were like the biggest archetypes. I pretty much just teched my Vespiquen with Bats and Yveltal at the time with a few Dark Energies, and it meant that I was really, really strong against Night March and Totina, thanks to weakness against Totina, and because I played Basic Energy, Chaos Wheel was much less of a pain. And I think I played Zoroark at the time as well, I can't remember, but yeah, like Vespiquen has changed and adapted this whole time just because the card is good enough to survive. Nowadays we see it be paired with all sorts of different things, mainly Zoroark and Evolutions and such, so the card is just so inherently good that you can always be good in the metagame as long as you're willing to adapt the list accordingly. So there we go. Speed and consistency, I've sort of touched on that already just because it is stage 1 and its energy cost is cheap, but at the same time, even though we're playing a high Pokemon count, a lot of these cards are consistency cards. Unknown helps you cycle, and we don't really have any slow items in the entire deck. They're all speedy cards, Acrobikes, Ultra Balls, VS Seekers. We play like 2 Special Charge and like Revitalizers and Stretchers and stuff. These are the only slow cards in the entire deck. Everything else is based on you getting set up. So the archetype is fairly consistent, and yeah, once you get into that late game scenario, if you are choosing to play Oranguru or Octillery, you can be relatively end proof to close out the game, which is also very, very good for you. So with that said, let's have a look at a skeleton list. I've put only 16 Pokemon in the skeleton because these are the most bare bones you can be. But I would say around 26 Pokemon is the benchmark people look for. It can go higher. I would advise not going above 30. But even with the 26 being included, there are still 5 open slots here. Nothing too crazy. We have the 4/4 Vespiquen, we have Tapu Lele GX and Shaymin EX. And then Unknown. Unknown has pretty much become a staple card. Maybe not always a staple 4 of, but you'll definitely use these to fill your Pokemon slots before anything else, because it is a free card and it's a plus power at the same time. It's just a perfect option for Vespi, so it is excellent. And then I would say around 10 Pokemon you're looking towards putting in based on either matchups or having other tech attacking Pokemon in there to fill out these slots so that Vespiquen can actually get into the high amount of damage that it needs. Looking at trainer supporters, tools and stadiums, we can see it's fairly thin on supporters right now, and I would probably dedicate 1 or 2 more slots to supporter cards. 4 Sycamore, 1 N, 1 Teammates, 1 Lysander. I think Teammates is a staple, even though some lists aren't playing it. I just think it's excellent for the deck because it guarantees double colorless energies, which in certain turns, you whiffing them basically loses you the game, and it just helps you keep ticking over so nicely. I believe 1N is only really necessary because of the nature of the deck. We are much more aggressive than our opponents, so we are rarely behind on the prize race, and it's down to the opponent to N us out of the game rather than vice versa. And Lysander, potentially a 1 of, potentially a 2 of. You can even consider Town Map in the deck if you just want to play a bunch of these 1 ofs. More often than not, it will be bumped up to the 2 count. Like I was saying, not really any slow item cards in the deck. 4 Acro, 4 Ultra, very, very speedy. The 4 VS Seeker to combo off on mainly things like Teammates and Lysander. Special Charge is going to recover double colorless energy, so you have enough throughout the game. Rescue Stretcher I've put in here as the 1 count over Revitalizer right now as the staple card, because typically Rescue Stretcher will be in here because of the other techs that you'll play. You want to recover Zoruas or Zoroarks or even Unknown. If you're going to Sycamore anyway, Rescue Stretcher can be an extra card from an Unknown. You can get back Shaymin and Tapu Lele as well to close out games as well with Rescue Stretcher. So I would say that the 1 count of Stretcher goes in before Revitalizer a lot of the time, but that can be based on how many Forest of Drought plants, if any, you play. That can change as well. And 4 DCE is all you'll be playing in terms of the energy, which is what gives us the amount of space that we need to start putting in Pokemon, which is pretty cool. And then with these remaining 5 slots, I'll be going over a few options, but Normally they're dedicated to stadiums, if any. Supporters either bulking up, like upping the counts of teammates and Lysander, or there are a few other options as well that I'll go over. And then the main thing is the 10 slots of Pokemon, potentially 10, potentially even more. Again, 26 is probably the lowest, I would imagine, you can get away with Vespiquen right now, when there's such high HP Pokemon in the metagame. There's things like Decidueye and Metagross, so we really need to get over high hurdles. So yeah, these are pretty important, and you can see at the moment I've only got one switching card as well. That's potentially going to be bumped up to 2 as well. Potentially cheeky, only having 1 Floatstone, but sometimes we have things like Zoroark to make that a lot nicer. So we will start looking at, first of all, the stadium debate. Personally, I think if you're going to play any stadium, it will be Forest of Giant Plants. This means that you can evolve up, which means if you lead combi, you can be going very aggressively with Vespiquen. Going second, you can get attacks off. Now that we have Choice Band, it really doesn't mean, it's not very difficult to get, you know, a 2-hit KO on your turn 2. No, sorry, your turn 1 going first, because you have Choice Band. We have Unknowns to cycle. We have, again, aggressive Lele for Sycamore, and then just dump whatever Pokemon are in the hand. You can start initiating the prize race that early, and at the same time, you're protecting what would have been a 40 HP combi, now is much more healthy as 90 HP Vespiquen. It takes a dedicated attacker to get over it, which is pretty cool. So I would play Forest. It also actually protects you a little bit against things like Ninetales, Tapu Koko, Decidueye GX, all of these sorts of things that are very efficient at sniping and knocking out combis in the early game. Forest will protect you there. The only issue being you can't really have the space for the 4 count, so you probably have to play like 2 and hope that you can hit it. So it's not hugely consistent that you will get aggressive Vespiquens. And if you're trying to defend against Decidueye, you know, they're playing for Forest already, so maybe you just don't play Forest, because that's the biggest matchup you have to be concerned about when putting Forest into play, and they'll do it for you. So it could potentially be a dead card. The other 2 stadium options are really just to manipulate your bench. Skyfield means that you can go a lot crazier with just benching whatever you play, and knowing that your opponent or yourself with a Field Blower or a second different stadium that you play can get rid of some of these Pokemon. It's great for forcing 6 non-EX Pokemon, because you can, as soon as the Skyfield gets bounced, you can get rid of Shaymins and Tapu Leles, which is excellent for you. And the same concept can be said for Parallel City. You get rid of your bench, which gets Pokemon into the discard pile for extra damage, and also denies the opponent easy prizes. At the same time, we can reduce damage here and there. I mean, Vespiquen is so fragile that typically it'll get knocked out regardless every single time, but maybe here and there it can help you. Bear in mind that if your opponent has Parallel City in play, you probably need to play like Field Blower if you're playing Parallel as your only stadium, because otherwise it can really hurt you if you're being reduced on damage, or if you're being reduced on bench that early on in the game, because it can stop you Klefki chaining and getting Unknowns down as well. So if I was going to play a stadium, I'd play Forest, personally. But you don't have to play a stadium anymore. You can play Field Blower as like a 1 or 2 of, 2 of being the maximum, or you can choose to play none of those cards and yeah, just go without a stadium. I'm actually right now the biggest fan of playing no stadium at all. 1 Field Blower. That's my line of thinking right now, because Field Blower covers a lot more than any stadium would do, in my opinion. And if my logic is to play Forest for aggressive turn 1s, only initiating a 2-shot sometimes when you find like your 2-of copy of Forest, you started combi and you have 2 Choice Band, I think it's too niche. So personally, I like to keep the slots for other tech Pokemon. But I know a lot of people are fans of stadiums, and if you were destined to play one, I would pick Forest over anything else. Next up is supporter options. Mallow is potentially a card that you can consider. We're already playing Teammates, which is a similar card, but if you are playing Oranguru, and more specifically if you're choosing to play Octillery in your list, Mallow can be an excellent card for guaranteeing more things. Bridget as well is a supporter which I've previously played in Vespiquen, actually, as a one-of. This was back when we had Compressor. I loved playing Bridget in the deck, and now that we have Tapu Lele, it's like the same thing. And being able to guarantee yourself, you know, double Zorua plus combi is just so good for you turn 1. And I feel like this is the supporter that is being neglected in Vespiquen. A lot of people are just going aggro Sycamore, nothing else. I'm actually a huge fan of Bridget. It also means that when you are playing these one-offs of things like Evolutions, even if you're just playing a single copy of Eevee and like one Flareon, things like this is excellent for you because Bridget can get that on the field early to establish it, and actually in the matchups that you need it, get it out quickly, which is more difficult if you're just playing a 1-1 line without Bridget. So in my list, I would 100% play a single copy of Bridget. If you're playing double Tapu Lele, I think it's a no-brainer for me, and in testing it is so good to go for Bridget. It's brilliant. Another supporter is Hex Maniac. There's a few ability decks around right now. There's Decidueye, which is great to shut off. There's Metagross, there's Vikabulu, there's Volcanion as well. Even Gallade Octillery could be a rogue popping up for all I know. Shouldn't be a matchup that's too difficult for you anyway, but having Hexes for all these matchups is going to be nice. Personally, it's not a speed card, so I won't be playing it. Bridget is a consistency card, so I like that over the Hex slot. But I can see people throwing in Hex. It's never going to be too troubling for you, and it's an extra option, so have a consideration of those supporters. Personally, I pick only Bridget, and then I would bump up my Lysander count, potentially my teammates' count as well. So that's the route I would go down. Now let's start looking at the Pokemon slots. I've put, as you can see, stars by the ones that I would like 100% play. Klefki does allow you to chain onto unknowns. Basically, you put down your unknown, you put down your Klefki, you unlock onto unknown, then unknown uses its ability Farewell Letter. So effectively, with one Farewell Letter, instead of getting one Pokemon in the discard pile, you've got two. So that is excellent at ramping up your damage. And at the same time, you have this ability against Mega Evolution decks. Right now, Mega Rayquaza and Mega Gardevoir aren't hugely popular. So I don't think you're using this ability too often against Mega Evolutions. Even then, we now have Field Blower in the format, so that primary effect that it was meant to be is a lot less useful, and you actually use it a lot of the time just to be extra plus powers. But that's not terrible for you. So if you need to flesh out your Pokemon lines and have more in the deck just to discard, Klefki may be your boy. Then we have Zoroark. This is a key player, like almost always in Vespiquen. He is like the partner at all times. Stand-in's fantastic for saving discards of double colorless energies. If you don't start a good Pokemon, for example, something like your Tech Eevee or your Oranguru or any of your unknown, on turn 2, as long as you get into Zoroark, you can just stand right into the active position rather than having to pay retreat on something like an unknown, which would be hideous for you. So this ability is fantastic, and Mind Jack is also very good. 10 base plus 30 for each of your opponent's bench. When everyone else is playing Lele for Bridget just to get set up, this is big bonkers damage, and that's really, really good for you. And Choice Band as well has improved its numbers also, so it's much harder to play around for the opponent. So this guy gives a lot of great early game pressure, which is really nice. Vespiquen sometimes can be slow at getting Pokemon into the discard pile if your hands just aren't cooperating with you. If you're drawing into tons of supporters and none of your Pokemon, having to Sycamore away non-Pokemon cards is quite bad for you. So Zoroark is pretty good early game pressure. At the very least at times, it makes your opponent set up slower, because they're putting less bench Pokemon down because you're threatening Zoroark for one-hit KOs, so it's pretty good. It also has a Psychic Resistance as well, which, if you can help it, at times can push it out of Garbodor range as a one-shot, so he's also a good option for that. And then we have Oranguru, which is commonly seen, and also Octillery, one that's a lot less common. I think it was Dylan Bryan who played it in a successful list a while back, and that could have even been expanded from memory. I'm actually a huge fan of Octillery, and the reason is because I play Bridget in my lists. So I'll get a Remoraid on board quite quickly, get that established, and get that Octillery going. Abyssal Hand is incredible right now for end-proofing and just keeping you topped up on cards, potentially delinquent-proofing as well. And when you're playing Zoroark anyway, you don't really mind its awkward retreat cost. Ability Lock is a thing right now, but a lot of the time Garbodor players have to go into Trashalanche to keep up as a one-for-one prize trade. Otherwise they're using things like Drampas or Espeon GXs, which we can race on too efficiently. So they're focused on finding other Pokemon, and they have to draw very well to establish Garbotoxin at the same time. And even then, you can choose to play Field Blower. Like I say, I flirt between 1 and 0 count. And if you're playing Octillery, I would lean towards playing 1 Field Blower because its ability is so powerful for you. And Oranguru, this is just the single card slot that comes in and is less draw than Octillery throughout the game, but is still the same intention that you can top up to 3 cards even if you've been end to 1 to give you more access to your last VS Seeker or your last double colorless to win you the game. And that's pretty much why they'll be in here. I would always play one of either Oranguru or Octillery because they're too important to close out the game. Next up, a big portion is evolutions, whether you choose to play them or not. I think right now, of all the evolutions, Flareon is the outlying card that you will almost always be playing because Flare Effect, gaining that fire typing is very strong for you right now. It gives you weakness over Metagross as well as Decidueye GX, 2 very important popular cards. And also Lurantis as well as a little bonus. That card is not being as popular as we once thought. I think Vika Bulu has become more popular than Lurantis Bulu. But it's still, you know, extra coverage, which is nice if you just randomly face it. The other 2 evolutions are also worth considering. You gain better Volcanion matchups. And in a weird way, you gain a better Ninetales Koko. Because you can evolve into Vaporeon and take use out of their Rough Seas if they're trying to spread damage all over the board, which is actually quite funny. Jolteon can do the same actually for copying Rough Seas. I should have written that down, which is weird. But Jolteon primarily going to help out Mega Rayquaza and Yveltal. I don't feel these are very popular. If you want to improve Mega Rayquaza, you may as well just go down a Klefki route rather than just shoving in a Jolteon, in my opinion. So yeah, if I'm playing evolutions, I'm playing Flareon for sure. I'd greatly consider Vaporeon. I think Jolteon is the least effective in the current metagame. So yeah, I think Flareon's important right now, going into Indianapolis at least. Next, let's have a look at resource management cards. Herdia and Milotic have been put in here and there. I remember the second place Seattle list played a 1-1 Milotic line. There are pros and cons to these cards. I personally am not a fan of them. I would not be playing these in my Vespi. I think 2 special charge and like 2 recovery cards, a combination of Stretcher and Revitalizer should be enough with 4 VS Seekers. The idea of having these cards is that you can recover important pieces. If I was going to play a stage 1 line to do this, I would just play Octillery to top your hand up in the late game situations. What I don't like is that you have to wait to evolve this guy on a certain turn for both Herdia and Milotic. And it's too cute to just sort of sit there on the bench, especially because they're bad starts in the deck, and Feebas is really fragile. It can be Sky Returned, it can be hit with an Umbreon GX with a Snipe for a knockout. It can do so many awkward things for you that it's not worth it. Lillipup is a little bit more tanky, but I believe Herdia has the worst ability to Milotic. It's less versatile. Although it can access pretty much everything. It can get you VS Seeker for your supporters. It can get you Stretcher to get energy back. Not to the hand, but at least back to the deck. And it can also get you Stretcher for Pokemon. Herdia is almost as versatile as Milotic is. So potentially that's the better one to go for. Annoyingly, it can't get you back Field Blower if a Garbodor's been established. You'd have to Field Blower then Herdia in preparation for the Garbodor to come back online, which is weird. But yeah, their ability line, which is awkward, and putting so many Pokemon on the board means that there's not that many. Even if you're playing like 28 Pokemon, if you're trying to bench all these Herdias and Milotics to gain their effects, it means that these Pokemon aren't in the discard pile. So maybe you have to combo them off with things like Parallel City. Who knows? So yeah, I think these are weak options right now. We have good enough recovery to see us through pretty much every game. So I would not be playing these. A few further options from me. I think Machoke is a really cool one. He improves Decidueye. Greninja should also be a better matchup. It's always fine, that matchup, just because you go so aggressive. Especially if you play Forest, that shouldn't be an issue. But he's additionally there, which can help. Ninetales is also cool, because you're not worried about Tapu Koko or Ice Blade. Espeon Garbodor potentially is better. You can be protected from the GX attack to save lower HP combis. But at the same time, they can just Garbotoxin, establish it and stuff. And Oricorio in lots of random decks. Pretty much a lot of people will go towards playing Oricorio in Indy. to have a better Vespiquen matchup, because it is a popular archetype, and having Machoke established means that that's less of an issue for you. Its 3 retreat cost is one of the limiting factors of Machoke, but if you're playing Zoroarks in there anyway, which you most likely will be, it can be mitigated greatly. The Persimmon package is an interesting one. Choosing to play like 1 Mew for Persimmon could be cool. You improve your Zoroark, you improve your Drampa, and you improve your Turbo Darkrai as well. If you play the Mew, you actually improve Espeon as well, because if you have Mew in the active hitting with Persimmon's team play, you can hit that for weakness and really tempo out on them. The awkward thing about the Persimmon package is you probably need to play things like Skyfield, and at the same time, their damage does become a lot worse because you're probably only playing like 2 rescue stretchers, so that damage depletes, and then they do become bench slots that are just wasted on your board when they could be Zoruas into Zoroarks and stuff like that, or combis into Vespiquens. So it gives you much better early game pressure against some of these decks, and hits for a great weakness right now, but your overall game plan is kind of diluted a little bit, and at the same time, these are 5 Pokemon in your deck that aren't hitting the discard pile in the early turns, so that can slow down the overall Vespiquen approach. But if you're expecting enough of these archetypes, it could be worth playing. And the final one's a bit wilder from me. I've just heard talk of some people trying to play this. I've not actually done it myself, but you can try playing Garbodor. I know Garbodor has been played in Vespiquen previously. That was when we didn't have tool removal, of course. But you can play, if you have plenty of Klefki, and if you have 1 or 2 Floatstone, you probably need at least 2 Floatstone. You can try and establish Garbotox in Garbodor. Against things like Decidueye, you can Klefki chain, even if you're under item lock as well, which is hilarious. You obviously have to remove the Klefki each turn, but you can just reattach new ones and such, which is pretty cool. It means that Decidueye don't have their abilities. Espeon Garbodor again is improved. Similar way I was saying with the Persimmon package, you gain Psychic weakness on them, which is cool. It does mean that you have to play a few Psychic Energy. I'd probably play only like 3 maximum if I was playing Garbodor. But that gives you an option to trash a launch, and again at the same time, you're a full non-EX deck, you're trying to race them, they're trying to play items just to keep up with you. Garbodor naturally gets into decent numbers. It's a similar concept to playing Trev Garb, really. You also improve your delayed matchup because you can hit that for weakness very early on as well. So, and at the same time establish Garbotoxin to ruin their plans. Garbodor, if you want to commit the spaces to it, could be a cool option. I've not gone down that path. I doubt many people will, but I just wanted to show it off because there's so many options for Vespiquen. I'm only listing a few here and there, but there's so many considerations just because any Pokemon is a viable option because it's a plus power when you don't need it, and in X matchup, it'll help you out. So yeah, Garbodor's a good card, so why not consider it, right? Few extra options from me, some basic Pokemon here. The Taurus GX has been played with before because it is an all double colorless energy attacking deck, and you don't have a GX attack that you'll use because Tapu Lele's is useless. Taurus becomes a pretty cool option for Mad Bull. Early pressure. If you're playing like 2 to 3 choice band, Horn Attack becomes great early game pressure, which the deck is definitely lacking. And in certain matchups like Turbo Darkrai and Volcanion, where they're trying to do little power heater pokes or attacks with Oblivion Wing in the early game, that can be heavily punished by like Lysandering their big EX target and Mad Bulling it all back onto them, so this can be very good for you. Mewtwo's an interesting one. It improves only Espeon Garbodor, but I believe that will be one of the most popular archetypes going into Indianapolis, so potentially Psychic is good enough for this. And again, when you have choice bands, this is a good enough card to get 2 Hickos in the early game and just fight off some early game pressure, which is cool, and it's a good lead for you because it's like a fine attacker. Speaking of good leads, Tapu Koko is like the best lead you can imagine in the deck, as it is a free retreater, it has high HP, and Flying Flip is a great attack. It pushes things into range just in general, and at the same time you potentially improve your mirror match because it sort of cautions them on how many combis they can bench, at least if they don't play Forest, and at the same time you have a much better Gyarados matchup. Speaking of improving Gyarados, you can play Oricorio as well. This is a card that I'm really considering. I should have put a star by this guy. I think he's like one of the best options on this page. Supernatural Dance is amazing for the mirror and also potentially Gyarados. Revelation Dance is actually really good against Espeon Garb as well. If you choice band Revelation Dance, you can do 120 on a Espeon, which is really good early pressure, seeing as though this could be turn 1 for you. So if you're playing like 3 choice band, again, you can go for that route. It's sort of weighing up how many Pokemon you want to play as opposed to how many choice band. I actually like a heavy choice band route these days. I play 3 in my list, so Revelation Dance becomes very powerful, and you're pretty much always winning Mirrors and Gyarados by having Oricorio in here, because Gyarados should already be a 1 prize to 1 prize slaughterfest. If you're playing Forest, you should be initiating the prize race, or even if you happen to lead Lele or Shaman, you can get the early prizes on Magikarps, and then Oricorio should at some point sweep up like double Carp at some point in the game, because you're just naturally giving up so many single prizes. They can't always stretch her back 3 targets into the deck to play around Oricorio. They probably won't even expect it in a game 1 scenario, so Oricorio, pretty cool option that I probably would be playing in Vespiquen if I can help it. So let's have some conclusions towards the text here. Evolutions and Zoroarks are the most common. Klefki is always nice just to fill out any spots that you have waiting around. If you don't want to go too crazy with text and just go simplified, you can put in even like 3 or 4 Klefki. That's absolutely fine. If you're playing the Forest of Giant Plants route, it's actually good to play Klefkis because it makes it worthwhile, right? It makes your early attack not just terrible. It's not like an attack for 50. It can become an attack for 70 to 90 or whatever else. It can go even higher if you're getting Klefki chains onto unknowns really quickly. So Klefki is still a good option for sure. And pick your Pokemon for the expected metagame. You can go as simple as you want, or you can get really exquisite by playing like 3 different 1-1 lines of stage 1s that you want in all these matchups and be potentially good enough to beat any archetype because you have an answer to this, that, and the other. So it's really down to you to see how focused you want your Vespiquen to be. If you want to be announcing Be Revenge every turn, or if you want to have different attackers, different options, different bench sitters, and that's really up to you. So, after all that, let's have a look at countering Vespiquen. I'm first going to look at some tech options that any deck can just splash in. Then we'll look at specific decks that naturally have a good matchup. And finally, I'll just have a little quick mention to a potential hard counter for Vespiquen, which not many people are talking about right now. So, resetting their damage is always good. Karen shuffles all Pokemon from both players' discard piles into their deck. Vespiquen's damage is, of course, based on the Pokemon in our discard pile, so you are able to just reset the damage to 20 base, which is really, really bad. And Karen is often the go-to option for tankier decks. Things like Metagross, where an Oricorio wouldn't really help you prize race very efficiently unless you're just taking so many hits in the early game because they haven't managed to achieve their damage that they need, or if they don't play Flareon. I think Karen's probably a safer route for these tankier decks because resetting their damage to that amount is just so much better for you. And the pros of Karen is Tapu Leleable and it's VS Secretable, so you should be able to access it on the turns that you need it. The awkward thing is, it's a card in your deck that in pretty much every matchup aside from Vespiquen is really bad. Obviously it has the effect of getting Pokemon back, which can be good in a pinch for you, and it can also clunk out the opponent's deck in terms of ending in the future, which could potentially be good for you. Overall, it's a low impact supporter turn, and it's not something that every deck can squeeze in here and there. It's pretty much only going to be used specifically against Vespiquen, so bear that in mind. You really have to consider Vespi a popular enough deck to consider countering via Karen. The alternative that I feel a lot more people will go for is Oricorio. The concept being, if the Vespiquen's dealing a lot of damage, so are you in response. Oricorio, with that Supernatural Dance, placing a damage counter on your opponent's Pokemon in any way that you like for each in their discard pile. Very, very good for you. You can combine it with Lysander on a awkward retreat Pokemon like Oranguru if they haven't got Floatstone established, and you can just ping off their Vespiquen on the bench and force them to spend a double colours just to retreat, and they may run out of attackers for that turn, especially if you can knock out something like the Zoroark, which would be excellent for you. And just in general, if they overcommit Pokemon in the discard, you can KO like a Combi and a Vespiquen in a turn. You can access pretty much anything that you've started to 2-hit KO. You can set things up, especially if you're playing things like Espeon GX, where you're already doing things like Divide and setting the damage counters here, there, and everywhere. Oricorio is going to be a really cool option for you. What's also great about Oricorio is he's really good against some other decks. Like I said earlier, when Oricorio was being put in Vespiquen, it can help sometimes Gyarados, it can sometimes help against Espeon Garb as well because of its early pressure with Choice Band and other Psychic Weak Pokemon as well. So potentially very good. It's also reusable with Rescue Stretcher, so if they deal with Oricorio once, they may have to deal with it again because we have Stretcher, we can just replay it, reattach, and go again, which is very cool. And as a single basic Pokemon with all colorless attack costs, it's very easily splashed into different lists. The awkward thing is, after game 1, your opponent is conscious of Oricorio. They know that you're going to go for it at some point, and your opponent can play around this damage. They can only do this to a certain extent, but at the same time, it will normally keep you out of range from getting cool 2 prize turns for a single Oricorio. And that's awkward because that's pretty much why you're putting him in the deck. You want to get a 2-for-1 trade, and that's going to set the opponent back, hopefully, in the race that they're trying to initiate. And the other awkward thing is it's usually a 2-for-1, and sometimes that's still not enough for Oricorio. If you're able to knock out a Combee and a Vespiquen, that's still excellent, but your opponent may have already just, closed out the game too quickly, depending on what deck you're playing. So simply putting in one Oricorio does not mean that you insta-win Vespi. You still need to have other non-EXs or cards that are able to tank hits early against Vespiquen to keep up in the race. Don't expect one Oricorio to win you every single time, unless your opponent is playing very, very poorly. Next, let's have a look at a couple of specific decks. If you're thinking Vespi is going to be a popular enough archetype, maybe you can consider playing one of these decks. Decidueye, especially with Ninetales, is very, very strong against Vespiquen. Actually, even the Plume build is very strong against Vespi. The ability is just so good at pinging off things efficiently. Razor Leaf is perfect numbers for dealing with a single Vespiquen target. Its HP is high. Its fire weakness is awkward, but you can ping off the EVs quite quickly, or you can just Lysander KO it with Razor Leaf, and it's a long way to get 22 Pokemon in the discard pile to one-hit KO the Decidueye. Even with Choice Band, there's still a lot to get in there. It's a lot to ask for. So yeah, Decidueye, probably a good matchup. Volcanion, again, they can play Vaporeon to improve this, but if the opponent is smart and goes for a heavy non-EX Volcanion route, it should be a really hard matchup for you. Power Heatering onto your other non-EX Volcanions is the way to win that matchup, for sure. Having just like 1 or 2 Volcanion EX on the board so that you can steam up through Vespiquens with weakness is important, but it should not be difficult for you as the Volcanion player. You just have too many non-EX threats that deals with their low HP board too quickly, and by that time you've set up energy on pretty much everything else to Lysander KO their Lele's or Shaymins or whatever else and just outrace them. And then a load of Ninetales GX, kind of similar to the Decidueye, where you're going to do like Coco and Ice Blade spreads for the early game. It's a little bit easier for them to get over the Ninetales eventually with that 210 HP. But I think if they're playing Coco, and especially if they play Espeon EX, which I like more and more in straight Ninetales, by the way, if they just go the heavy Coco route and do that for like 3 turns and then just devolve your board, you lose the game. So I think Ninetales has a strong matchup against Vespiquen. That's all, of course, if they're not playing Machoke. So yeah, bear that in mind. Machoke could save you against Decidueye and Ninetales, so it's definitely one worth considering. Finally, let's have a quick fun look at the potential hard counter, Giratina EX. I actually tried this on stream on Monday. It didn't go so well for me, but the concept is still there. Chaos Wheel is very strong in the format right now. Decidueye Ninetales and even Decidueye Plume, very reliant on double colorless energy. Drampa Garb and Espeon Garb, very reliant on DCE. Vespiquen is DCE reliant. Gyarados is DCE reliant. Gallade Octillery is DCE reliant. And lots of other rogue cards out there right now, very reliant on double colorless. Even things like Mega Rayquaza, of course, Giratina is excellent at dealing with. So having Chaos Wheel could be the way to win Indianapolis on your side. So using maybe a Turbo Tina list with things like Elixirs and Reshiram. We saw that, I believe in Brazil, it won an event. I think it was a special or potentially a regional. And that was really interesting to see. So maybe that pops up again because, like I say, early Chaos Wheel just absolutely wins games at times. Stonewalls opponents when no one's playing Ranger, obviously, and even things like Drampa, they can get rid of double Dragon Energy, but you can just play Machinery X anyway, so that's pretty much the route I would go. It could go in Darkrai Dragons. Maybe it's time for that deck to be popping back up again. It's been a deck that's gone deep in tournaments before. The shell could be pretty similar. We have to be a little bit more careful about the amount of items that we use in the deck. But the shell was also, like, pretty much always fairly consistent and deals good damage. And its matchups aren't that terrible when you have Giratina on your side. From then on, you're only really worried about things like Metagross. And what else is bad for you? Not much else. Vikabulu is hard, I guess. But Dark Dragons doesn't sound like a bad archetype. And even Giratina Hammers could potentially be creeping back in. Flare Grunts and Hammers are good against a lot of things. You can even play Giratina with Garbodor, like it used to do with Hammers, and then you have Garbotoxin on your side as your late game sweeper. I actually tried an archetype on the channel that was like aggro Latios Dragon's Garb. That did okay for me. It was weird. The deck was like really bad, but I was still getting decent results with it, and that's just because I was winning games off of Chaos Wheel or just off of Garbotoxin, and the combination of those two is pretty powerful, so maybe there's a route there as well. Who knows? Giratina seems like an interesting card, and being one that is absolutely off the radar right now, so it's one that I'm keeping in mind, maybe testing for Indy, because I think Vespi is a deck worth countering right now. So, if you did enjoy this discussion, and I've helped you out in building your own Vespiquen list, and have started you off with a good skeleton to get creative and make your own perfect 60 for Indy, I would love to hear it down below. What techs are you choosing to play? Which ones would you never put into the list? I'd love to hear it all down in the discussion. How well placed is Vespiquen for Indy? How popular do you think it will be? Will someone be able to go all the way with it? I know quite a few notable good players have been piloting Vespi. Rahul's been running it for a while. Pramwa obviously won an event with it. Jeffrey done well. I believe Alex Hill has had a crush on Vespiquen for a while also. Lots of players may be bringing it to the event, and I feel like it's one that will definitely be in the top 32, potentially once again even deeper into the tournament. So leave a like to this video if you did, subscribe to the channel if you've not already, but for now guys, it has been Joe from OmniPoke, and I'll be seeing you guys next time. Cheers.